Hello and welcome back to the channel. As always, I'm your host, Morgan. This week we're going to get back into my what climate change does to the world or the effects of climate change. I haven't quite decided what to call this little endeavor because it kind of changes in my brain depending on what my mood is. But today we're going to talk about how climate change affects agriculture. I'm sure everyone understands what agriculture is and why it's important, but if you don't for some reason, I thank you for crawling out of the rock you've been living under and joining society. Agriculture is essentially what feeds the world in the form of crops, the pasture land and livestock, and to a lesser degree, the fisheries and things like that. And because of this, it's important to understand how climate change will affect this industry, especially as we're moving towards a world with a very high population. Food shortages are already a concern for people. Climate change is an existential crisis for the human race. And if it's going to affect feeding the people that are on the planet, we need to know how and what we can do to lessen any negative effects and maybe bump the positive effects. Right now, nearly half of the Earth's land surface is used for agriculture in some way, be that the pasture land for livestock or the cultivated land for crops. I don't have specific statistics on the fishery side of things, especially since fisheries are a harder thing to get some statistics on because this aquaculture is a little bit of a newer field and I'm not as familiar with it. My primary area of study is how climate change affects these wild ecosystems, so agriculture in general. While I am familiar with this stuff, I'm more familiar with the plant side of things since I have more of a background in that stuff. But let's continue on. So the thing about climate change and agriculture is that this is a very complicated discussion to have, not only because like a lot of climate science, like a lot of, oh my gosh, what is going to happen with climate change in regards to insert topic here. There is a lot more research that's needed. Most of the research is ongoing, and in some areas we have a lot more question marks than we have answers, and that's sometimes frustrating for the general population, especially since, at least in the United States, we don't promote I don't knows and question marks as entirely acceptable answers, whereas in science, those are acceptable answers. And like some of the research that's coming back is showing that climate change is not necessarily only going to have negative effects on agriculture. And that's going to be kind of an interesting discussion that we'll have towards the end of this video. We're going to focus on the possible negatives first. First, let's take a look at areas that depend on winter snowpacks up in high elevation environments for their water throughout the drier summer seasons. These areas are like California, and I believe Colorado as well. Now, I focus on California when I talk about a lot of things because I'm from California. I'm very familiar with the ecology of California. But what we mean by areas that depend on winter snowpacks for water throughout the rest of the year, the quick and dirty of it is California and areas with climates like California have very little rainfall when compared to other ecosystems. So you have these chaparral, desert, Mediterranean ecosystems and biomes, and over the winter, they're kind of beneath these mountainous regions that get a lot of storms, a lot of snow. Now, This will usually continue on into the spring a lot of the times. And then as spring and summer progress, the snow melts, the snow ends up in rivers, rivers take the water downstream, water is collected, it's used for agriculture, human society, and also maintaining water in the ecosystem. And this is something that happens in places like California. That's how a lot of the agriculture in California is able to survive, is because of this water provided. A lot of it is from the high Sierras. So think the Yosemite region. Back in 2019, when my partner and I went camping in Yosemite, that was a very high snow year. And when we were leaving the park, there was still snow up to the side of the car when we drove through the high Sierras regions, or up by Tuolumne Meadows and those places. So that's like an example. That snow will collect in those regions, go into the rivers, end up down in reservoirs like Hetch Hetchy and other places that will then supply communities with the water they need. Because in places like California, we do get these seasonal rains, but in general, when all that snow is happening in the mountains, that's the winter time, that's when we're getting our rain, which a lot of plant growth doesn't tend to happen in the winter time if we're talking about traditional crop plants. Now, the native plants in the areas, yes, they do a lot of their growth over the winter and very early spring. We're not talking about those. So the issue here is, as we're seeing the climate changing and these temperatures rising, there is a trend that there's possibly less snow, which then could lead towards not enough water for crops to properly flourish and produce, which then that means those plants will have water stress and poor production, or even perish and not be able to produce. And then any livestock in the area that depends on that water, there may not be enough water for their needs, which is not only meaning that the livestock won't be able to drink, but also the water that goes to growing the plants that produces the feed for the livestock. When we talk about livestock water, we're not only talking about what they drink, we're also talking about the water that goes into producing their food. But we're not going to get that in depth right now. So the point of this is these areas that depend on the winter snowpacks, the higher temperatures, if we're not getting that snow, if it's all rain throughout the winter, we don't have that water later in the year, because if it's not snow, it's not going to be there. If it's rain, it's already going to go into the rivers and flow downstream. But that's just one possible negative outcome. That's one thing that we're seeing in some areas. Yes, we're still seeing these very high snow years. Climate change is weird, and storm patterns are changing all over the place. Again, more research to understand exactly what's going on. But we're also seeing areas experiencing much higher temperatures. And this is concerning because the crops grown in these areas are now susceptible to heat damage where they weren't before, or there would still be a danger before, but not as much. And you're also seeing more drought, you're seeing more water stress on the plants, and this is producing crop death and poor production in some cases. Again, none of this is very extreme yet, but the point is we're seeing evidence of it. And also with these higher temperatures, there is a point in which livestock will not necessarily be able to handle an upper temperature barrier. Every living thing has an optimum temperature range for survival, and if you cross the low or the high end, then big problems. And as we see these higher temperatures, we see that some areas that are currently very productive, currently the optimum area for livestock crops, may no longer be available for agriculture just because of these very high temperatures. And that is concerning. And besides these areas that depend on the winter snow and these high temperatures we're seeing, if you think about the United States, so the West depends on these winter snowpacks. The West is a lot drier than the East. And actually, the study I have linked down below talks in depth about the East. So in general, the Eastern United States and places with similar climates have kind of plentiful showers and humidity throughout much of the growing season for their agriculture, which is a good thing because then they don't have to do quite as much in the ways of irrigation. Unfortunately, we've been seeing a trend in less rain in the last years, and that's problematic for farmers in those regions because the irrigation is not already in place to kind of combat not having enough rain. And so now the question is being raised, how do we affordably get the irrigation there and deal with not enough rain so these crops don't just keep dying because they're not getting enough water? And so that's a big problem there because traditionally these areas would have plentiful showers throughout the growing season, and we're seeing that's not what's happening now. But again, like the theme of this, there's still a lot of ongoing research being done, and that is something that needs to be addressed. And then we're also seeing these unpredictable spring weather patterns. So this kind of is broken down into two parts. These periods where we're getting early warming in the season, which then kind of stimulates crops to germinate and show growth too soon. And then we get freezing events later in the season, or just these random warming and freezing events, which then end up killing plants, reducing crop yield. And a lot of it is if we get that early growth too soon and then a freeze right after, that is very bad for a lot of plants. And whereas if we didn't have that early warm that stimulated the plant to grow, that dormant plant wouldn't have had a problem with that freeze that happened. It's a little bit more intricate than that, but in general, that's the idea of it. If you have a plant that's adapted to stay dormant until a certain temperature hits, which would traditionally mean this is the end of the freeze season, everything's starting to thaw out, it's good to go, good to start growing, and then all of a sudden a freeze happens again, you have all of these meristematic regions that are now exposed. That just means regions of growth. Plants have these little regions in them that the growth happens and new cells are made in those regions, pretty much. So these regions have now been stimulated, and then all of a sudden a freeze happens and they're kind of damaged or killed entirely. And we're seeing some crops and plants in these farms be susceptible to these freezes, where in the past that wouldn't have been an issue because you'd get the warming, and once the warming happens, you might have some colder, frosty temperatures, but you wouldn't have these late season freezes that we're seeing. And those are some of those negative impacts that are really easy to see now because we are already collecting data, seeing these things happen. But as these things continue, we may just lose usable land entirely. Again, it's going to be that temperature thing. And it may just be too hot to farm. Or as sea levels rise in the more coastal areas, there is a threat to usable farming land, because even if it's not necessarily underwater, it may become too high salt content in the soils. Just because the seawater isn't necessarily over it doesn't mean that salts aren't going to get up there, and that's an issue that's going to need to be addressed as well. Because if there's flooding due to a storm or anything, it's possible that that land's going to be rendered too salty to farm in, and that's something that needs to be addressed. What we're seeing with a lot of the research at the moment is that the effects on fisheries are probably going to fluctuate by season, and there's not enough really done there to say much more about that, but you'll see more drastic changes in temperatures, or not temperature, excuse me, prices season by season, depending on how the fisheries are handling it. And in the most severe models that we're looking at, food will become much more expensive if climate change is not addressed, if plans are not put into place, if things don't happen to mitigate this. And that is not just going to be a country, like a US thing, that's going to be a global thing. In general, the trend is going to be that food will become more expensive, and that's going to have to do with all of these negative effects we talked about. But let's end this on a little bit of a positive note, a little bit of hope. Not saying climate change is good here at all, but there are some trends saying, because as we're seeing these things change, we're going to also see areas that are usually used for a specific crop, with the weather and climate patterns changing, no longer able to grow that crop. You may be able to bring something else in. Say on the East Coast, if they're growing something that requires a lot of water, really needs that rainfall, and they can't really accommodate that anymore, it's possible they can look into more drought-resistant crops that thrive on the West Coast that have never been able to successfully be kept out there. And that's really the big idea there. That we're gonna see what's grown where kind of change, and that may be a positive for people that want to change it up a bit, but overall, this is still something that needs to be thought about because this affects all of human society. Food production is already an issue. There's already talks about how do we feed everyone on the planet, and what really needs to be asked as well is how do we feed everyone if climate change affects agriculture in these ways? And this needs to be addressed in those conversations as well. So I do hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day, afternoon, evening, what have you. I do hope to see you in the next video, and that's all for now. Thank you again for watching this video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell if you would like to see more. And if you'd like to follow me on any of my other social medias, the links are down in the description below. Don't forget to check out thereptilegoth.com for all of my articles and blog posts. If you found any value in this video and you would like to help support the channel, please check out my Patreon page. That link is also in the description down below. And a special thanks goes out to my Diamond Dragon patron, Diane V. What you're doing is really helping me fund a dream here. I will see you guys all in the next one.